So both today and tomorrow are going to revolve around objects. Today we'll be kind of doing the introduction to objects, much like we did the intro to arrays. And then starting from tomorrow, we'll be talking more about object methods. So what are some kind of applications of objects? So let's get to it. Okay, objects. So an object in the technical definition for an object is that it's an unordered collection of key value pairs. In JavaScript, we call it an object. In Python, we actually call it a dictionary, which I really like. Because the way to think about it, analogy, if this was a dictionary, is I would say that a dictionary is a collection of words and their definitions, much in the same way that here an object is a collection of keys and their values, right? So objects can also be used to store values, but whereas in an array, we store the values based on where they are in the array. So we do it based on position, right? We say at index 0 or at index 1 or index 10, there are these values. With objects, we don't store them based on the sequence. We store them based on something called keys. And so here, if I look at lines 8 through 11 in my object, I have key 1, colon, value 1, comma. Okay, just so we're really clear on the syntax here. The colon, oh, I'm not sharing my screen, am I? Oh, God. Again. Okay, let's have it last time too. Okay, so don't worry, you didn't miss out much on the slides from earlier. Okay, sorry. So yeah, right. So if I look at the object here that I've made on line 8 called my object, notice how in my array I just store two values in sequence. Here on line 8 through 11, I create an object, and hopefully everyone's familiar with the syntax of an object where the beginning is the open curly brace on line 8 and the end is the closing curly brace on line 11. If I look at lines 9 and 10 there, you will notice how on line 9, key 1 is to the left of the colon, that's the key, and then the value that's associated with the key is on the right hand side of the colon, right? So it's almost like key 1 is a word, and then value 1 is a definition, right? Like that's the value that's associated with the key. And each key value pair, line 9, is separated by a comma that we see the end of line 9. So that comma separates each pair of keys and their values, right? So once again, in my object, we have two key value pairs. The first pair has a key of key 1 and a value of value 1, comma, and the second key value pair has a key of key 2 and a value of value 2. And so very much like how when we access values in the arrays, we use the bracket notation, and within the brackets we put in a number that represents the index that the information is at. With an object, we still use our bracket notation, except rather than putting in a number, because objects have no position, we actually put in the name of the key. So in this case, I put in key 1 as a string to access value 1. Okay, very, very basic stuff here. So for example, here on line 2, we'll see kind of an example in which an array is actually not the best data type for us to use. Why? Here in this in this array called Pusheen, I have 3 data points, but it's not really clear what those data points represent. However, if I choose to store this information in an object, I can still store the 3 values of Pusheen, 7, and Gray and Tabby, but now I can actually associate a key, right, or almost like a descriptor with each of those values. So here on lines 10 through 14, my Pusheen object now has 3 keys: name, Pusheen, comma, so the second key value pair is age, colon 7, and then for the third key value pair, the key is color and the value is Gray and Tabby. And so now not only am I still able to store all 3 pieces of information, but now I'm actually able to associate a key with it, right? So that just kind of makes it clear to the user what I'm looking at. Usually the keys should be descriptive of what value it's trying to hold. Type of an object is an object, so hopefully that's pretty straightforward there. And when we talk about creating objects here, one thing to know is that in the previous examples, you might have noticed how we had quotes around the key names, right, to indicate that the key is a string. One shortcut that we can actually take is in JavaScript, the keys of an object always have to be strings. Okay, so in a lot of cases when we make the key, we actually don't even need to put quotes around it, because what JavaScript's going to do is JavaScript's going to take whatever key value you gave it and it's going to convert it into a string on your behalf, right? So if I look at this object called Pusheen I'm creating on line 6 through 10 here, right? For the Pusheen object, notice how the keys are name, age, and color, but now I no longer have quotes around it, but it's not a problem to JavaScript because when JavaScript reads that line, it's going to say, oh great, this is a key of an object. Let me convert it into a string first before I store it. And so basically what it does is it saves us the trouble of having to manually type in the quotes to make it into a string because JavaScript is going to coerce it into a string no matter what we do. Okay. However, one thing to just be very clear here, right? The keys of an object always have to be strings. The values, right? So everything to the right hand side of the colon, the values associated with those keys can be any data type you want. It could be strings, it could be numbers, it could be booleans, it could be other objects. That can be whatever you want it to be. It's just that the keys of an object always have to be strings. And so because of that, when we type it out, we're actually able to disregard putting in the quotes there because it has to be a string by default, and JavaScript will enforce that rule. Okay, so like I said before, accessing values in an object is very, very similar to the way we access values in an array. We still use our bracket notation, except now instead of putting in the numerical index or the position within the brackets, we put in the key name. And so just like how, remember how we access an array, if my array only has 5 things and I try to access index 1000, I don't get back an error, I get back undefined. Well, that's the same exact scenario here too, right? On lines 11 through 13, I'm accessing keys that exist in the Pusheen object, right? Name, age, and color. And when I do, if I look at my printout, I get back the values associated with those keys. However, when I try to access a key that's not in the object, I get back undefined. And so once again, just be careful here. If I try to access a key in an object that does not exist, JavaScript will not throw an error back at me. It will just say, oh, I think you meant to get undefined. And then if we're just trying to, kind of just wrap up this idea of accessing keys here, right? Before I could just pass in a string, but I could also pass in a variable, right? So on line 12, notice how using bracket notation, on line 10, I have this variable called key to check. I set it to the string name. If I pass in key to check into the bracket notation, then JavaScript will say, oh great, that's a variable. What does it equal? It equals the string name. And so therefore on line 12, I'm console logging out Pusheen and getting the value associated with the name key. And on line 13, same idea. I have 2 strings. I'm concatenating it together into one single string called color. And so when I print it out, I get back the value associated with the color. Okay, so we don't just have to put a string in between the brackets. We can put in anything we want. We can put in other variables as long as that eventually evaluates into a string. One other thing to be aware of, and this is something that you actually might see a lot in the wild, but I personally think it actually makes it more confusing, especially when you're first starting off learning JavaScript, is we are able to use brackets to access the values associated with keys using brackets, but we're also able to use something called dot notation to access values as well. With dot notation, and we see a few examples of it on lines here, on lines 11 through 13, right? Notice how if I just do Pusheen dot name, I don't need to use brackets, A, and 2 is I actually don't even need to specify that name is a string, right? Because what happens is whenever I use dot notation, the underlying assumption is whatever my dot is, that is going to be the exact name of the string. And so what JavaScript does is it takes everything after the dot and it converts it into a string for you. Okay, so when I do Pusheen.name, even though there's no quotes around name, what JavaScript does is it takes that name and it turns it into a string, and then it looks up the name key inside Pusheen, and it also does it for age and color as well. Now here on line 9, I still have my key to check variable and I set it equal to the string name. The difference is on line 14, when I do Pusheen.keyToCheck, remember If I use dot notation, the limitation of dot notation is that I cannot use variables, right? Whatever comes after the dot has to be the exact name of the key. And so here when I do pushing dot key to check, I'm not looking for a variable called key to check. I am literally looking for a string or for a key called KEYTOCHECK. I am actually looking for that string. That is why pushing.name, age, and color will print out the values associated with it. But when I do pushing.key to check, it will prompt JavaScript to go into the pushing object, look for a key called key to check, not find it, and give me back undefined. Okay. So I'll do a quick pause here and see if there are any questions from folks.
How do you, again, go over how do you add, or did you get to adding an element?
Not yet. Not yet. No. Nope. That's actually I think that's the next slide. Yeah. But any questions on any of the concepts I've covered so far? Makes sense, folks? Cool. All right, so as we'll address Ray's question now, how to add a key value pair. Adding a key value pair in a JavaScript is, for objects, it's almost identical to how we do it for an arrays, except rather than specifying the position, we just specify the key, right? So here, I'm a pushing object on line 10. I say pushing. Here I use bracket notation. I put the key sister in quotes, so I know it's a string and not a variable. And I just use an equal sign, the assignment operator. All that does is that says, great, now I will add a key called sister to pushing, and the value associated to that key will be whatever is on the right hand side of the equal sign, which in this case is the string Stormy. Similarly, I can also use dot notation to do the same thing, right? With dot notation, I don't have to use quotes to specify it's a string, but I have to make sure that whatever comes after dot is the exact name of the key I want. In this case, it's brother. And so here I'm setting, hey, pushing.brother. The brother key is associated with the value pip. And now if I console log out pushing, notice how I've now have been able to add two new key value pairs to pushing. I can use it with either bracket notation or dot notation. The only limitation here is that with dot notation, obviously I have to specify the name of the key and I can't use any variables. Yeah, Jolene? Yep, that's the next slide here, right? Yeah, no. So your intuition is exactly correct, right? Yeah, if I want to overwrite an existing value, I just do the same exact thing. I just access pushing dot, in this case, dot age. So here on line 9 we set it equal to age equal to 8, and then on line 10 we edit age, right? We add 1 to it. And so if I want to overwrite the previous value, I do exactly what you just said. I use object.key and I set it equal to whatever new value I want it to be.
And could you add, like, let's say, arrays to that instead of strings?
Yep. The values of an object can be anything you want it to be. The keys have to be strings. I'm sorry?
Is it the same way? Like,
Yeah.
So pushing thing equals to array.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Everything to the right hand side of the equal sign is just all of the JavaScript that we've seen so far. Anything is fair game. The only difference, the only limitation here that we just want to kind of be mindful of is just to know that, like, if you overwrite something, you overwrite it right away. You're not able to tell what was there previously. And then the other thing that I also get asked is if I define the same key twice in an object, whatever is defined the second time will just overwrite what was defined the first time. So it's almost like in a dictionary, you're not going to have any word appear more than once, right? Like every key is unique. Every key will only appear once, and therefore every key will have a unique value. Cool. Last but not least, in terms of basic operations we do with objects, we also have the delete keyword. Delete is, as you can probably assume, it's a reserved word in JavaScript. If I do delete pushing age or pushing index or bracket age, or delete pushing.color, that deletes both the key and the value. I will say that in general, you don't see this used very often. If you think about a dictionary, right, you wouldn't delete all the words that you don't use. Seems kind of silly. And so generally with an object, people don't delete the things they don't use. They just choose to ignore it, right? It's like, having a few extra key value pairs in an object nowadays don't really take up too much memory, and so there's no harm in having it being there. People just don't use them. The only credible reason that I've seen in terms of why people would delete a key value pair is for security. Reasons. So let's say I pull all of your data about your account into an object, and I have your name, username, and also your password. Well, before I pass this your account to anyone else, I may want to delete the password key value pair, right, to make sure they don't have it. Otherwise, right, even let's say it's not password. Let's say it's name, email, and birthday. I can give someone else your name, age, and birthday, and if they say I don't need birthday, it's like, well, just don't use it, right? And so in general, you don't see delete used very often unless there's like a very very targeted use case. Okay, two more things I'm going to wrap up here for today, right? Pretty quick lecture. The first one is very simple. The second one, I think, is people struggle with just a little bit more. So I'll spend more time on that. The first one is JavaScript has something called the in operator, and the use case, as you can imagine, is extremely straightforward. If I use in, and if I do key or variable in an object, what the in operator does is it returns back a boolean, true or false. And all that true or false is saying is, hey, is that key in the object, right? In this case, on line 9, it's does the name key exist in the Pusheen object? And on line 10 is does the sadness key exist in the Pusheen object? And so for name, it exists, so we got true. For sadness, it does not exist in the Pusheen object, so we get back false. Okay. So the in operator, I think, is pretty straightforward. It just gives you back true or false. The reason why we cover is because there's actually a more powerful application of the in operator, what we call the for in loop. So what a for in loop is, a for in loop is actually something that we use to iterate through all of the key value pairs in an object. Okay, so let me explain what that means. If I give you an array and I say, hey, can you go through every single thing in the array for me? You would say, oh, great, I'll start at index 0 and I'll work all the way to however long the array is -1, right? Like that's how I loop through an array. And that makes sense, except with an object, there's no concept of length, right? Like everything kind of exists in one go. And so what we use a for in loop for is a for in loop allows us to loop through an object. But one of the things that for in loop does is for in loop does not care about order. For in loop will go through every single key in the object for you, but it may do it in, I guess, an unpredictable order, right? So it's almost like saying like, hey, if you have a dictionary, the for in loop will read out every single word to you, and therefore you will hear every single word, even if you don't know what order in which the words are going to come. And so the reason why this is really powerful is because if I say, here's an object, I'm going to give you, I'm going to loop through every single key for you. Well, all that means is now you will be able to have access to not just every key, but because you have access to the object and a given key, you also have access to that key's value too, right? And so if I look at line 9, right, if I say for and then let Vicky in Pusheen, the let is a reserved word. That means I'm creating a variable, right? The in is a reserved word. That's the in operator. Pusheen is the name of the object. And then Vicky, in this case, is just a variable name. We can name that whatever we want. And so what line 9 is saying is, using our for loop, let Vicky in Pusheen, that means this loop is going to run however many keys we have in the object. And on each iteration, the variable Vicky will represent a different key. And it will do that until we've gone through every single key in the object, right? So on line 10 there, right, for each loop within this for in loop, I will console log out Pusheen's, I will say comma Vicky is Pusheen index Vicky. Okay, So once again, right, notice how Pushin's Vicky is basically me saying the key. So if this Pushin object has 3 keys, when I run this for loop, it's going to run 3 times. On the first iteration, it says Pushin's. If I take a look at the top right hand corner of my screen, Pushin's name. So on the first iteration, the first key that it goes through is name is, and then the value associated with name is just Pushin index Vicky, right? And the second time this for loop is going to run, because it has to say, well, there's still more keys in the object I haven't covered yet, right? The second time it runs, the key is age. And so we print out Pushin's age is Pushin index age, which is 7. And then last but not least, for the third time it runs, it says, all right, what other key has not been, have I not gone through yet? I've not gone through the color key. And so it will say Pushin's color is, the value associated with color in Pushin, which is gray and tabby. And at this point, the for loop says, great, are there any more keys in the Pushin object that I haven't iterated through, I haven't gone through yet? And the answer is no. And so at that point, the for loop ends. Okay. So the for loop is a very powerful tool that allows you to go through every single key in an object, but it does go through every single key in an object. So if you say, I only want to go through some of the keys, well then the quick answer is to not use a for loop, right? It's to say maybe set your own custom array or set your own search, or to determine which keys you go through. For loop will by definition always go through every single key for you. Jolene, did you have a question?
Yes. So how is that? Oh, is that different from the for of which also can be used for arrays or objects?
So you can't use a for loop for objects, right? So if I say, for example, let x equals, and I have 1 comma 2 comma 3, right? I can say, oh great, for let I equals 0, I is for of loops.
So for let element of Pushin, because I thought there were 2 types of loops. One is a for in and one is a for of.
For of loop. Let me check. I've never seen that used before. It might exist. Let me just take a look. For of versus for. Let's see. Let's take a quick look at how they're different. For of is okay. Okay, yeah. It looks like what for of is basically a for loop, but for arrays and strings. But it doesn't seem like you can use for of for objects, because for of only works for iterables, which typically are arrays and strings. For in loop are still things that only work for objects. Yeah, so I think for of loops can replace your traditional for loop when you use it for an array, but I think it's unrelated to for loop and objects. Yeah, yeah, no problem. Okay. Any questions on for loops? So we're going to go through a few more examples of how this works, right? So once again, let me just be very. Oh, sorry. So given the previous kind of explanation of how for loops work, right? Looking at this code here, right away, right? Everything looks the same except on line 10 there. Rather than using pushing using bracket notations and putting the key variable in between it, here I'm doing pushing dot key, and this is a common error that people make, and it's something that you will see very clearly if you print it out. The big error was using pushing dot key is, remember, dot notation means whatever comes after the dot is not a variable. It's the actual name. It has to be the name of the key. And so here, when I look for pushing dot key, I am literally looking for a key spelled KEY in the pushing object. And notice how the pushing object in lines 3 through 7, right? There is no key, right? There's name, age, color, but nothing called key. And so when I run the for loop, and I do this 3 times still, right? Because as far as JavaScript is concerned, the pushing object has 3 keys. I'm gonna go through all of them for you. At every single iteration, the key is correct, the key, the first one. So it's also get Pusheen's name, age, and color. But the value is, when I look up for the value, once again on line 10, Pusheen.key looks for the value associated with the KEY key. And because a KEY key does not exist, the value therefore is undefined. And so here when I print out undefined 3 times. Okay. Are there any questions with the for and loop before I move on to the one super small tidbit? So just so we're all clear here, right? This thing can be whatever we want it to be, right? In is a reserver. We have to use in. For is a reserver. I have to use for. Let I have to use because I'm creating a variable. Pusheen or whatever it is has to be the object. But this can be this variable. Here I call it key. I can call it David. I can call it anything I want. That's just a variable that I made up. But in the body of my loop, that variable also becomes a substitute for each key's value for each key's name, I guess we'll call that, if we go through it. So in the first iteration, key is equal to name. The second iteration, key is equal to age. And the third iteration, key is equal to color, right? Once again, don't get too hung up on the order. The order may not be consistent or it may change, but just know that a for loop will go through every single key in the object for you. Okay, any other questions? All right, just one last small tidbit. If for some reason you only want the keys in an object, well, if I use, in this case, notice how the O is capitalized, which means I'm now dealing with the objects class. The objects class has a handy function called .keys, and when I invoke that function, all I need to do is pass in the object. So here on line 9, I do object.keys, I pass in the Pusheen object. What that will do is that will return for me an array with all of the keys as strings. In the printout there on the top right hand corner of the screen, we have an error there. We forgot to put quotes around each string. But just know that object.keys will return back an array, and that array will have all of the keys in the object. This is not something that people use super often, but if you do need it, that exists. And similarly, object.values, and I pass it the object, it will give me back all of the values in an array form. Once again, don't assume anything about the order. Just know that it will give you an array with all the keys in a order, right? But don't try to guess on what that order is. Generally speaking, if you care about order, use arrays. If you're using object, then the default assumption is, hey, I don't care about order. And then the very, I promise, this will actually be the last thing. Yesterday we talked about how arrays can hold other arrays. Well, objects can hold anything you want in there as well, right? And so here on line 4, I think maybe it was Jolene or someone asked earlier, well, what if I want to store an array? On line 7 there, that's just how the syntax looks. It's everything to the right hand side of the colon is a plain array. But if you remember how we talked about nested arrays, how you're able to kind of say, hey, here's the array, and let's use one bracket notation, and then let's use another bracket notation after it. If I'm going to a nested arrays, the same exact ideas apply here, right? On line 10, if I do Pusheen.colors, right, I get the value associated with the colors key, which is an array, and I can directly say, give me the element at the 0th position of that. Give me the first element in that array, which in this case is gray. And if I ask for a second element, it would be tabby. So the chaining that we looked at for nested arrays also applies to nested objects as well, right? So here, if the value of a particular key is an object, so in my Pusheen object under siblings, my value is another object, I can do something like, I see on line 13 there, which is say Pusheen dot siblings, which is now an object, dot sister. And now that gives me back the value associated with the sister key in the sibling key of the Pusheen object. And similarly, I can do it for brothers. And in both of these places, here I've used dot notation in both places. I could very well also easily use bracket notation or mix and match. There's no performance difference. That's pretty much it. So, and
I have a question.
absolutely, go ahead.
Is it okay to say that the dot notation, because there's all these brackets and braces between arrays and objects, they tend to look alike. Is it okay to, as a rule of thumb, to say that uh, all objects are the only ones that use the dot notation for, so that way at least we can understand that as an object, as in when we see it in code. Do arrays ever use dot notation outside of the length, meaning the method?
Um, so arrays don't use dot notations because it only takes the numerical positions. Um, there are times in which you will create. So for example, like you will create your own classes, and so if I say for it's a little bit of like complicated. It's a very complicated. It's a good question. The answer gets unnecessarily complicated. Um, I would say for now. So one is definitely like get comfortable with seeing square brackets and curly braces. Like those two are things that you will see very very commonly in JavaScript. So if those two are tripping you up about what they mean with relative to each other, definitely like take some time to just go over that and make sure you're clear on what that looks like. Um, if I use something dot something, usually I will be referring to either a method or a property, right? A method is just a function, a property is just a value. Associated was whatever came before the dot. Um, Technically, you are correct in that everything in JavaScript does boil down to an object. But I would say that people use dot notation more as a shortcut to not have to type out the brackets and the quotes. And I wouldn't read too much into it beyond that. Yeah, no problem. I mean, it wasn't like a super great, elegant answer, but it's just for now, just think of it as like a shortcut that people use. And so if you see it in the wild, you know what it means. Um, I don't necessarily want us to get into the complexities of kind of like, how JavaScript kind of stores everything as an object, like fundamentally. Cool. Are there any other questions? All right, sounds good. Um, yeah. So let me just stop the recording, and then I will